Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'd like to welcome you back to another in our series of NRL live streaming sessions. Every other week on Wednesdays at this same time, we will discuss a new topic and want to encourage you to provide as much input as possible by calling or texting us with your questions or comments. And you can call or text us toll free at 1 844 424 0500. That's 1 844 424 0500. We are doing these radio shows and streaming sessions to help community members and the general public get a better understanding of exactly what is involved in the federal impact assessment and provincial environmental assessment processes, and to encourage viewers and listeners to participate in both of these activities. With me today is my usual co-host, Mr. Qasim Sadiq, who is the project co-lead for the Northern Road Link project. Good afternoon, Qasim. And as always, we've got a lot to talk about, don't we?
Good afternoon. Absolutely, Don. Looking forward to a discussion on water today.
Yes, a big topic in communities always, and a big focus of environmental assessments and impact assessments. As we mentioned, in talk about the different groundwater and surface water investigations that are going to be done as part of the and are being done as part of the environmental assessment or impact assessment. Without further ado, Qasim, let's get started. Maybe you can do a quick run through of what we're covering today.
Yeah. So in today's session, we'll start with a discussion on the objectives of field studies. We'll talk about what will be studied for groundwater. Then we discuss what will be studied for surface water. Then a discussion on study areas for groundwater and surface water, followed by a discussion on field studies for both groundwater and surface water. Lastly, we talk about the potential mitigation methods associated with any impact on groundwater and surface water. And as always, we will leave our listeners with our contact information as well, Don.
Thanks, Qasim. And let's start now with a brief discussion of the objectives of the groundwater and surface water field studies. So if our team can shift to slide number 3 of the presentation. So there's two main objectives, and they're pretty straightforward. The first one is to identify and look at potential effects on the groundwater and surface water resources resulting from the project. The second one is basically providing recommendations on how to minimize any effects that are identified. That means effects on groundwater and surface water. So those are the two sort of umbrella objectives as that we that are kept in mind as we conduct our studies. So, Casa, maybe now you can go through what actually will be assessed as part of the groundwater studies.
One of the main studies within water, Don, is groundwater. In terms of what will be studied, let's look at slide number 4. So assessing, we start with an assessment of potential changes to groundwater recharge and discharge areas. You want to look at groundwater level, particularly seasonal changes, because as we know in Northern Ontario, seasonality is a very big thing with water. And it impacts both groundwater flow and movement. And you want to look at it by understanding the soil, which in our case includes both peatland and the muskeg, and understanding the bedrock geology, groundwater level, and saturated thickness and significant recharge areas. You also want to look at an attempt to define the potential zone of influence that the project, including supportive infrastructure required. So think of things like access roads leading up to camps, aggregate sites, and so on. that they might have on groundwater quantity or flow of movement. So all of these different aspects of groundwater, from how the type of soil, the bedrock geology impact the nature of groundwater, impact the ability of the project to have an overall effect on groundwater. All of this will be considered in these studies, Don. So in addition to that, sorry, we're looking at slide 5 as well. In addition to that, we're assessing the physical, chemical, and biological properties of groundwater that can change as a result of the project. And the ways this could change is that we're trying to determine the proximity of sensitive groundwater features such as drinking water supply wells and springs, because a lot of communities in all across Canada and also in northern Ontario use wells and springs for drinking water. So these are highly valuable community level assets. Then you've got highly vulnerable aquifers that can potentially be impacted by the road itself, as well as by the supporting infrastructure that I just discussed on.
Kasim, just on the general topic of water, my experience has been visiting communities, is that, it's always at the top of the list of issues, and concerns whenever impact assessments or environmental assessments are undertaken in a traditional territory. It's so vital to the community as a whole for a multitude of reasons. Um, and 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 I think community members are often surprised because they don't expect there to be so much focus on water, and but there is a huge amount of focus on water, both groundwater and surface water. So let's now move to look at what will be assessed regarding surface water. So that's slide number 6, please. So similarly to what Qasim talked about with groundwater, we look at both quantity and quality. And in terms of quantity, one of the key tasks is to assess possible changes to flows, to water levels, to erosion and sedimentation patterns. And by erosion, I mean soil loss. So if you imagine water running off overexposed soil with no or very little vegetation, carries the soil with it, and that's called erosion. And then when that reaches a water body like a creek or a river or a lake, that that becomes what you call sediment, and then it settles in the bottom of these water courses and can damage or destroy aquatic habitat. So trying to manage erosion and sedimentation um, is really important exercise, as in terms of the construction of the road, and we'll get into that in a minute. But the way that we assess these changes is by there's a couple different ways: determining the number of and type of water body crossings, the magnitude of the changes uh, caused by the project to stream flow and to water levels, um, runoff rates. Because if you're changing the landscape, you might be causing changes to runoff rates. You're creating smoother surfaces that carry material off them more quickly, maybe increasing flows, and so that's one of the things that are looked at in doing the assessment. And then you're changing the landscape, you're changing the shape and of the land, and that affects drainage patterns, or can affect drainage patterns and land cover through removal of vegetation, for example, and that can cause changes to erosion and sedimentation rates. Erosion occurs naturally in everywhere, but if you remove vegetation, um, then it can accelerate erosion, and then of course sedimentation is the result once that soil gets into the water bodies. If we can move to slide number 7 now, please. So then the other component that we study when it comes to surface water is quality. So when we talk about quality, we're essentially talking about the biological, chemical, and physical properties of surface water in the project area. And so we look at possible increases in concentration of suspended solids, so which can be a reflection of sedimentation. We also look at the chemical composition of the water, and the reason why we do that is because we have to define that baseline. So um, there may be good reasons why the chemical composition of water in one area of the study area is different than in other areas, just because of could be some of the minerals that are in the ground in the area. There could be a number of different reasons, but we have to conduct these baseline studies to get an understanding of what the chemical composition of the water is. And then by doing that, we can then try to predict impacts from the road construction, either during construction or during its operation, or of certain things like incidental things that might happen, such as fuel spills. As much as you may try to design for them, there may be situations where that might happen, and if that's the case, where are the sensitive areas? You don't know that until you get a very good, accurate idea of the existing conditions, and that's why we conduct the baseline. So Qasim, let's move now to talk about the study areas for groundwater and surface water, starting with the temporal boundaries.
So that slide 8 for the team. Now, temporal boundaries. That's what that refers to is the time for which this is studied, or the time that's considered within the different baseline studies related to the project. Now, of course, when you go out there and you sample either for groundwater or surface water, that's a point in time, and you're trying to assess what that means, what the project means to groundwater, for example, or surface water over an extended period of time. So that comes to define a project's temporal boundaries. So for the construction phase, we're looking at 3 to 10 years. All the activities associated with the initial development of the road, as well as the ancillary infrastructure that both Don and I talked about. The aggregate areas, the campsites, the access roads leading up to those sites as well. So construction is considered over a 3 to 10 year horizon, and what that construction phase means for groundwater and surface water. Similarly, if you've read the tour closely, because that is now a public document, it talks about the fact that there is no long-term plan to dismantle or decommission the project. The project is expected to be permanent, but for the purposes of certain valued components and baselines, such as groundwater and surface water, we assume a temporal boundary of 75 years. So, in other words, we assume that the project will be operated for the next 75 years. All activities associated as such with operations and maintenance of the road, including that permanent ancillary infrastructure that will start after construction, although they will continue indefinitely. A duration of 75 years is used for the operations phase for assessment purposes, because you've got to try and quantify the impact of the project at the operation stage, and you do that for the foreseeable future. And we've assumed that to be as as unforeseeable as 75 years can be. We've assumed it to be 75 years. So it's quite an extended timeline to sort of think about operations. It's not the next 10, 15 years, it is 75 years, even though in reality, the project is a permanent feature of this part of Northern Ontario once it is built on.
Thanks, Qasim. Yeah, 75 years. When I think about that, it's It's beyond my expiry date, Gossip. So, okay, let's move
Well,
to
our kids are going to be pretty old at that point as well, Don. So it's and that sort of maybe helps contextualize things. That 75 years,
yes.
it's not just a generational thing. It's multiple generations that we're not talking about. So it is quite an extended time range to consider something.
It definitely is, Gossip. If we can move to slide number 9, please. Let's talk a bit about the study areas for groundwater and surface water, starting with groundwater. So the study areas are there's three main study areas. There's the project footprint. So the project footprint is the right of way associated with the road, as well as all the other facilities associated with the road, either temporary or permanent. So temporary ones might be construction camps, could be equipment and material laydown areas. They could be access roads to temporary gravel pits or quarries, but there are also permanent structures that are built to support the road, and they might be quarries or gravel pits, and they might be permanent access roads, and there might be crossing structures associated with those access roads if they have to cross water courses as well too. So the project footprint is not just the road; it's all the other facilities, temporary and permanent, that are associated with the road. Then there's the local study area, and the local study area is defined for groundwater as 1 kilometer from the project footprint. So if you draw an extra kilometer around the project footprint, that defines the local study area. And then finally, there's the regional study area, and the regional study area um, is typically a much larger area. But in this case, because uh, potential project effects on groundwater from a project like this aren't anticipated to be any greater than the local study area, the regional study area is the same as the local study area. So we're basically working with two study areas here: the project footprint and the local study area. And Qasim, maybe you can talk a bit now about the surface water study areas.
Yes, absolutely, Don. So, just in terms of the surface water study area, once again, we're talking about two different types of study areas. The first one is the local study area. So, that's slide 10 again. Thank you. Um, so, we're looking at the local study area, the LSA or the local study area that encompasses the quaternary watersheds crossed by the project corridor, and that's essentially the area just around the project. So you're primarily concerned with environmental characteristics fairly close to the project itself. The boundary tends to be defined by individual valued components. But the regional study area is a study area that significantly expands the geographical scope of the study. The RSA encompasses the catchment areas as defined by the tertiary watershed scale of each water body which is crossed by the project corridor. And it starts upstream from the headwaters to downstream to James Bay or Hudson's Bay. So really, from the origin to its almost in a way of saying point of termination, and that encompasses the area outside of the LSA to measure broader scale existing environmental conditions and provide a regional context for the maximum predicted geographical extent of direct and indirect effects of the project. Now that is a very significant and very large area to consider, which reflects the importance of groundwater and surface water as key valued components to be considered within the project on.
Thanks, Qasim. Let's move now to a discussion of the field studies, groundwater and surface water, starting with groundwater. So if our team can move to slide 11, please. There we go. So we will be installing groundwater monitoring wells along the preliminary preferred corridor. Um, as Qasim talked about earlier, it's very important when it comes to water to do monitoring at different times of year to understand the changes over time. Um, and so our groundwater level monitoring and sampling will be done in spring, summer, and fall. Obviously, winter is virtually impossible because of how frozen everything gets. So but still, by covering those 3 months, we get a pretty good understanding of seasonal variations uh, in water levels and water quality as well too when it comes to groundwater. And then we're going to be taking groundwater samples, as I've mentioned before, and these will be analyzed for a lot of different things. Physical parameters, so physical measurements such as pH. pH is acidity of the water, temperature, uh, general chemistry, uh, including hardness of the water, which is sort of the mineral content of the water, turbidity, which is basically like water clarity, total suspended solids, which is similar to that, total dissolved solids, um, metals, and then organic and inorganic compounds, which are chemicals, chemical compounds that contain, in the case of organic, they contain carbon. Inorganic, there's no carbon, and then cations, nutrients, and radionuclides. So these water samples, these groundwater samples, are being thoroughly tested because we need to really understand the chemical composition of the water at different areas in the study area before the project is constructed. Because again, we have to have that accurate baseline, that snapshot of the way things are now, in order to be able to accurately predict what might happen as a result of the project being built. So maybe you can talk now, Kasim, about the surface water field studies. Slide number 12.
Yeah, so similar to the groundwater program, surface water is a fairly large and comprehensive sampling program. It doesn't quite have the requirements of the groundwater program because you can collect samples, and we intend to do that with 15 high priority water bodies, which are on our crossing sites. And the idea is to collect samples in spring, summer, and fall to help establish seasonal variations in existing conditions. Water quality parameters for the surface water sampling program will be the same as those that you just talked about, Don. So we will be considering the same elements within this program. So water, at the end of the day, whether that comes from the surface or from the ground, we're sort of assessing it for around the same parameters. Water body information, again, where feasible, we're looking at water depth, we're looking at the flow data, which once collected at different bodies will help us characterize existing hydrology. Otherwise, where we don't collect that data directly, flow will be estimated by prorating, which means estimating flows from previously collected flow data in local and regional study areas of the project. So essentially through modeling, but you're painting a fairly comprehensive picture of surface water.
Thanks, Kasim. And if our team can move to slide number 13, please. We'll talk about potential mitigation methods. Now, again, mitigation means limiting impacts in this context, and the methods that we're going to list off to you and describe to you, these are potential ones and they're general ones. And what happens is, as the environmental assessment is conducted, we gain more information about the study area. And by doing that, we are able to provide more prescriptive, more specific mitigation methods, and then we can recommend where different methods can be applied in terms of within the study area too. So as we gain more information, this information gets very much more refined. But in a general sense, to avoid sort of uh, causing groundwater and surface water impacts, um, what we there are some things that we can do, and those include selecting locations for equipment, materials, and discharge points to be away as far away as possible from water bodies like creeks, streams, rivers, lakes, or other sensitive environmental features. So that's one approach. We could also treat or remove suspended solids like such as silt from runoff during construction, so that it's not getting into the water courses and affecting aquatic habitat. Another common approach is to use erosion and sediment controls, like filter bags, silt fences, erosion control blankets. And again, what we're trying to do here is prevent that soil loss. So, when there's exposed soil and there's rain, we want to try and prevent that runoff from there from getting into water courses and silting up, as they say, or bringing in like excessive amounts of sediment so that it impacts the fish habitat. And then we would monitor and test groundwater and surface water quality during construction as well to make sure that that our measures that we're putting in place are working, and if they're not, we have to figure out what we need to do to make sure uh, that they are going to work. So those are some techniques there. And then another approach, another mitigation method is to identify sites for temporary or permanent aggregate extraction pits and production facilities um, in areas that avoid negative effects, bad effects on surface water and groundwater resources. So we have to keep that in mind when we're trying to position these different facilities that are sort of support the road itself. So maybe Cossum, you can finish off some of the potential mitigation methods that we've identified.
Yeah, thanks, Don. That was a great sort of starting point on potential mitigation methods, and a couple of more that will be considered include sort of identifying sites for supportive infrastructure. You know, those temporary lay down and storage areas and construction camps that we talk about that minimize and or avoid adverse effects to surface water and groundwater resources. So where you've got different alternatives available, it is possible that one alternative helps you avoid potential impacts on groundwater and surface water. So you opt for the one that helps you minimize that effect. Then you identify best suited structure types. You know, for example, whether that's culverts or bridges, you look at span length, life cycle, and construction staging methods at different water body crossings. By sort of managing and looking at different iterations of these different aspects of the engineering aspect of the project, you can minimize some of those impacts. Then design of watercourse crossings to account for potential future increases in flood intensities based on future projection based on climate change is another thing that will be considered, which is, you know, something of course people in Northern Ontario don't need to hear about from us, Don, because it's just you can tell about those climate change effects on a regular basis. So we have to account for that at the project level as well. Then you've got to design permanent water course crossing, drainage inlets and outlet locations with rock protection to help mitigate potential erosion during operations. You know, if you've got flooding, if you've got significant water runoff, you've got to mitigate against potential erosion during operations. And then lastly, you've got to implement operations and maintenance grading techniques and material storage best management practices to minimize erosion of potential and potential transport of sediment laden runoff, which is a technical way of saying that, you know, when water runs off, it carries with it potential materials such as gravel and sand and soil, and all of that can come to sit at at the base of different water bodies. So that sedimentation, that runoff, you want to try and manage that and avoid that based on engineering design as well. So these are the different ways on that mitigation can be considered for groundwater and surface water.
Thanks for that, Qasim. And that wraps up today's NRL discussion. Thanks as always, Qasim, for sharing your thoughts in this discussion. It was a really interesting discussion, I think, and water is such a big topic. And I hope that our viewers found it helpful in trying to understand these water related field studies. And we'll be back again in 2 weeks when we talk about air, noise, and vibration field studies. And we would like to invite you to visit our website, northernroadlink.ca. There's lots of really good information there. We're constantly uploading information to that website, whether it's videos or uh, text or whatever. There's lots of different kinds of information available there too about the project, and you can also follow us on social media at NRL Roadlink. So again, thanks very much for joining us. Join us again in 2 weeks. Miigwech, and see you soon.